In meeting minutes.
We have a motion to approve. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The next item on our regular agenda is a discussion to amend the LDC, Land Development Code, and mainly talking about multifamily residential density. And Frank, I assume you're going to be our spokesman on that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Frank Hall. So what we've been talking about with the UDC committee for a while, and some of you know this, is the residential density increase, potential for a residential density increase for multifamily development in the downtown business district. This idea started with one of our pre-application conferences with an applicant who wanted to have some apartments in the back of a building in the downtown business district. In order for it to work for this particular project, they were looking at 6 to 9 multifamily units. Well, at pre-application conference, it came out that on a 7,500 square foot lot, which is most of our lots in the downtown business district, give or take, that he could only do 3. Currently, you have to have at least 7,500 square foot lot to get 3 residential units. In order to get more than 3 residential units, you have to have a larger lot and then, in addition, provide certain amenities such as like open space or a gym or some other kind of amenity for the apartments. To date, and again, this is the boundary of the downtown business district. As you can see, we all know where it is figuratively, but this is kind of, when you see it on a map, it kind of shows you what area we're talking about. So in the current code, we have opportunity for all types of residential uses, single-family dwellings, duplex dwellings, and the multifamily development. However, once you get 3 units, you have to have that 7,500 square foot lot. You can't increase the density without having more land area, and we just don't have that kind of lot size in the downtown business district. So we brought this before the UDC, Unified Development Committee, and it was discussed and unanimously supported that there really is an interest in increasing the density in the downtown business district. One way to do that is to simply go with the base density of 58 dwelling units to the acre, irregardless of lot size. Keep it simple, so to speak, and delete the other options for things like a game room, a gym, a swimming pool, recreational amenities, open space, private partnership elements, things that to date have never been tried or even used because, quite frankly, I don't think it works. So the proposal before you is really just a discussion item, but we would like to bring it back next month or in another meeting for a public hearing to consider amending the Land Development Code to simply use a straight residential density like our other zoning districts of 58 units to the acre. On a 7,500 square foot lot, instead of 3 units, that would allow 9. Now, the word's gotten out about this. We really started this with one applicant. Since then, I've had 2 other people in the downtown business district call me being excited about this potential amendment because they own property in the downtown business district. Our comprehensive plan, general plan, the 2015 general plan calls for a mix of residential commercial uses in the downtown business district. The introductory statements in the Land Development Code calls for a mix of residential, commercial in the downtown business district. So it is supported by other documents as well. And we do have other people that are interested. They couldn't be here today, but they asked me to mention that there are other people interested in this amendment besides the one that's Mr. Grissett, who's present here today. So with that, if there's any questions to talk about it.
Thank you. I've had a couple of thoughts on this, and having been in the multifamily business for a number of years previously in a former life, I was shocked that we were allowed 58 units to the. I don't know how you get that without going up several stories, and that was my question when I was looking at the code change. And I'm all for getting rid of that extra language about rec rooms and specific things that just looks like somebody was trying to plan stuff too nicely. But my question was, why can't somebody go up in the downtown area?
They can. They can go up. We can go up to a height of, I think, maximum of 50 feet in the downtown business.
And is that
district.
what you see as the result of this, is that we'll end up going up to get those 9 units?
Yes, sir. Given for the smaller lots, George just reminded me we can go up to 100 feet with an SUP, special use permit.
Good luck, George. We had trouble, I think, at 54 feet on Montezuma and Sheldon.
It's not a suggestion.
Thank you, George.
I would think that most of the, if this amendment were to pass, we are talking about vertical. The lots in downtown, most of them are small or smaller size.
Sure. Yeah. What is there parking regulations? Gwen and I were just talking about parking on a different matter from years and years ago. Is there a parking component to this that?
No, sir, there is not at this time. The parking component, the applicants for any type of residential development would still need, in the downtown business district, at this time, would still need to provide the off-street parking requirement.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Frank.
Yes, sir.
In the original, or the revision of the Land Development Code, wasn't a provision made for the downtown district to have an owner of property reuse that property for a higher and good use, which would be providing for the modern millennium smaller unit apartments, but without parking, and that there was a fund that they could either put money into a fund for parking, buy something else for parking, but it wasn't a necessity to have on-site parking like it is when you're in a suburban area.
For residential units, there is still the requirement for parking. There is an opportunity for a fee in lieu to be paid into for parking.
Okay.
Other uses such as the service industry, retail uses, restaurants, bars, and the like, and in buildings prior to 1968 do not need the downtown parking requirement, but the new residential uses would still have to provide it. But there is that fee in lieu option.
Okay, so we can do some modification there and modify that fee in lieu of it. Because my personal opinion, having been around quite a while, is that as the demographics change, the young people today are not even getting driver's licenses at 16. And I think everybody in this room knows that, my goodness, I'm 16 years old, I can finally get a driver's license. It's not the case anymore. They pick up their doodad and they call Uber and they say, take me out, I'm going out for a few drinks. And they don't need the amenities that somebody needed 20, 30 years ago. So we've got to stay on top of these new trends and satisfy what the market is demanding, and that's an apartment, and it doesn't need a parking garage attached to it or parking spaces on site.
Good
Thank
points.
you. At this time, though, we're not prepared to go into that now with that depth of parking.
Okay,
but we
but
know we need to address it, but not.
Right. It all leads into this basic, though, of allowing for more density on these smaller type lots in the downtown business district.
Yes, sir.
Granted. I'm in
George, do you have
favor
a
of it.
comment?
Yeah, is there one water meter per parcel? Does this impact the water estimates for the particular unit?
Of course.
So
Wow.
you might have 6 apartments running off one water meter, or?
Yes.
Frank thought this was going to be easy.
No, it's just the water, there would be 1 meter for the units. There could be others if there was 2 buildings. They could do 2 meters, separate buildings. It all depends on how it would be set up when the project came in for
They'd
development.
have to get another water agreement, wouldn't they?
Yes,
If they're increasing their density?
but that's with any development.
Yes.
Even if you had a commercial
And
development, there
again,
could
it's
be.
first come, first served. So if they need an allotment from the water committee on a certain amount of usage based on the number of apartments they got, it's first come, first served. They're in, they got the water in their bank, they get it. There's no water in the bank, you got a good project, but you can't supply it with water.
So, if I'm hearing this correctly, I've always shied away from the water issue because it's well above my pay grade. I don't get it. But that could really be the Achilles heel for stuff like this?
Well, That's with, right now, I really want to stay focused on the increase in residential density.
I'm sure you
The
do.
water, the water issue is, as you know, an issue for all development projects throughout the city right now. But that's sort of a second thing to this. It's not, no matter what we change in the code, no matter what we change anywhere in the city, water is going to be an issue from here on out, but we're not prepared to discuss water today. That falls into place with water service agreements as the project develops, but none of that will be an issue if residential density doesn't get increased in the downtown business district anyway. So I really think
But
today...
I think maybe what George is trying, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it brought it up for me. If we recommend approval of this, are we sanctioning water usage in this decision?
No. They're totally separate processes. It's just like approving any other change in use or a change in density or allowances in a certain zoning district for any project. The water is a whole separate track that goes on a separate path for any development project.
Okay, thank you. Does that help?
Well, yeah, but if we brought in 100 more apartments, then that might be 25 acre feet. I mean, it could add up over time, and we'd have to be aware that this would be coming. And I'm assuming Jim would discuss this with the Water Issues Committee.
But we're not bringing in apartments. We're not applying. We don't have a project in the works right now. We're just making it possible for somebody to submit.
Can't help resistance. George targeted me out there. Planning and zoning is land use. We're concentrating on land use, not on the water. Water is going to be another issue that'll be taken care of in a different forum than at P&Z. So just understand that what's on the table is consistent with a general plan, which was overwhelmingly voted by the public. So what staff is bringing forward is something that was sanctioned by the majority of the people in the city of Prescott, and it has to do with a different use of land mass in the downtown area. So we need to concentrate on that. The water will be taken up in a different forum, not at P&Z.
Thank you. And that's exactly the point I was trying to make, is that that's not part of our component, and that by recommending approval of this, we don't therefore dip into the water system automatically. That was very, thank you, Jim. That was helpful.
Yep, I think the, in general, I mean, having more residential use downtown, I think is a good idea. Higher density, I think is a good idea. There's a big shortage of apartments in town, and, having them centrally located, I think benefits everybody. And also, it's a small area. I mean, it's also dried out. And if it works well, it might even expand, where the densities might increase outside. But right now, it's a small area, and it'll keep it alive. And it's a good balance, too. When business people go home, there's still activity downtown.
Mr. Good.
I respectfully disagree with that concept. I've lived all over the West, in Denver, Northern California, Texas. I've seen a lot of different zoning and density issues in practical sense. I'm very concerned about protecting the historical and small town atmosphere of Prescott, and adding high density development in the downtown area, I think could have a very negative impact on Prescott's historical character and small town feel. I think it will have a significant impact on traffic. Whether Uber ever expands in any meaningful way is speculation in my estimation, and I think we have to probably expect that every resident is going to have a vehicle. Specifically, I looked at Mr. Grissette's email and his proposal of adding 6 units on top of 132 Montezuma, and the only way you could do that is to extend the height pretty dramatically. And once we start that, I could see, 30, 40, 50-foot high developments around Whiskey Row, and that would have a huge impact on that historical area. So not that I'm against density and having more efficient utilization of property, but I think we have to move very carefully on where we do this so it doesn't have a true impact. I mean, we just voted on the general plan with over 80% acceptance of the density listing in that general plan. So to all of a sudden start changing those density requirements this soon without a really careful study of its impact, I think is premature.
Thank you.
So that's my comment.
Frank, do you have any comment in reference to the general plan's been mentioned twice here? Could you refresh us and the public as to what the general plan speaks to in the downtown area?
Yes, sir. Let me find that sheet. First, I'd like to say I appreciate your comments, sir. One thing that we need to remember, too, is that any development in the historic downtown will also go before the Historic Preservation Commission for review before it's approved and gets through the final process. So there is another vetting with the Historic Preservation Commission.
And Frank, I'd like to add to that that the historic district downtown is separate than, but it is part of the downtown business district. It's a section within a section is what I'm trying to get at. But the downtown business district stretches a lot further out, northeast, south, and west than does the historic preservation district, which is that half a block around the courthouse for all the frontage on the 4 streets facing the courthouse and the alleys behind it. So there's a distinct difference between the historic preservation district and the downtown business district.
There's overlap. You're right.
Runs all the way up to Carlton and some of the other areas that are not part of the historic downtown district.
So in the staff report, I put an excerpt from the general plan, and it says, preserve the identity and image of downtown as a historic government, business, cultural, and residential center. So the word residential, by expanding cultural and leisure facilities, activities, and maintaining a mix of uses for the benefits of both visitors and residents. And then maintain and encourage an expansion of the mix of commercial and residential uses in the downtown. So when I saw encourage an expansion of the mix of commercial and residential, I felt that was supportive, and that's out of our general plan. And goal 2.1, promote higher density, mixed uses, multimodal connectivity, and pedestrian amenities in the downtown and surrounding areas. That's also in the 2015 general plan.
Thank you. I think it's important to recognize that downtown's always been a very peculiar entity. Some of us give great reverence to it, some of us resent it, but downtown is very unique, and I think downtowns over the years do change. I think what we have to remember here is the Planning and Zoning Commission simply recommends to council what its thoughts were based on discussions just like this, taking a lot of input and a lot of character. I think what we have to be careful of here is that we do have other entities that control whether something will get there. We're not saying, this group is not saying this will happen. We're just saying that if it's feasible with the other restraints, that this could happen. And in many cases, I think we have to look at what downtowns over the country have become. They really are a focal point, but they're not everything for the whole community. And I think we've had situations here in our downtown where because of height limits, we've stopped buildings from being built, and people had to move buildings around and put them in floodplains in order to get the height. And all I think this, Phil, is talking about is giving a sanction that if someone wanted to be able to build a couple more units in a 7,500 square foot lot, that they could do it to help, in fact, foster the downtown area. When I look at 7,500 square foot lot, I could actually put more units in there than just 3. They may not be very large units, but I think you have to make things available for the community to have, there's going to be so many other restraints. We hit the chord on one with water. We could hit the chord on another one with preservation. There's so many other restraints that can prohibit that. But I think sometimes if you're not careful in allowing certain things, you could really inhibit yourself in the long run. That if somebody, there's a lot of buildings in downtown, as I understand it, that have the second and third floors boarded up. I don't know how productive that is for a downtown either. So I don't know how many people would come into Prescott and build a 5-story apartment complex. I just don't even see that as a fiscal possibility. But I like this proposal because it gives some of those unusual uses in our town, or buildings in our town, in this small area, the right to have some downtown living. We've got people trying to build a house downtown that's much bigger than this. But the comments that I hear on that is that that's great to have more people living downtown so they can stroll the streets and the shops don't have to close and the restaurants don't go empty at 6 o'clock at night. So I think there's a lot of merit to a proposal such as this. And there's still a great number of restraints that if we're not comfortable with everything in this document or this proposal, there's still a great number of restraints that has to take place. So I'm all for this. I think it's a good thing for a historic district in downtown. Do we have any opportunity today to have the public talk?
It is a discussion item today, so it's not a public hearing, but it's certainly open to the chair if he wishes.
Well, I would like to hear, I'm seeing the engineering department here. Every time I look at a face, I'm seeing engineering, but there are a couple of faces here that aren't from our own departments. Do we have any comments from the public in reference to this? Yes, sir.
Jim Grissett.
Good morning.
Mr. Chairman, good morning.
Address.
And thank you for all your comments. I really appreciate them. I own the property at 136 South Montezuma, and I was sort of the instigator of this request with George and Frank. Yeah, I just look at it as I've been hanging around here about 25 years, and I look at the downtown area that goes to sleep at night, and there's nothing going on, and the trend has always been, downtown. And downtown at night is a ghost town. And so I thought it would be a good idea to have some apartments, not large groups of them, but something like I could put in behind my property. So I think all your comments are valid, and I appreciate them. Any questions you have of me?
No, I don't. Any other commissioners? No,
Yeah,
thank you, though.
I think when we originally applied for the units, we actually misread the density standards, and we saw 58 dwelling units per acre. But then it was my understanding that if I built a hotel on a piece of property, it was virtually unlimited within the height limit of 50 feet. And the same comment was given to me about the 100-foot deal. They run you out of town. But
That takes a big bank account, too.
yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, you'd have to own the whole city council in the city to do it, I guess.
Yeah.
But when we knew that we could put in a hotel on a property, and I've been looking at other properties, and I intend to buy more land in Prescott downtown area. I look at a hotel and think, well, gee, if I can go unlimited hotel rooms, pending, of course, building code issues, ingress, egress, elevators, fire, all parking and everything else, I think why would we be restricted on apartments? Since someone can come in and stay in a hotel as long as they want anyway, and essentially, even though it wouldn't be classified as an apartment, they could call it that and live there as long as they wanted. So anyway, I appreciate everybody's concern regarding this, and we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Appreciate you bringing that up. Hey, he brings up, I think, a good point. And there's other uses. Sometimes we trip over terms. There are a lot of hotels that are permanent living hotels where it's long-term extended stay. So, I think we just got to be careful that we allow our community to have the ability to grow the way it needs to grow, and not try to restrict things with terms that have real vivid definitions. Yes, sir. Name
Jim
and address.
Lundy, Trend Use Research and Management, Electrical, Mechanical Engineering, and Developmental Investment. I think you're
excuse me, sir, we need your address.
My address?
Yes.
Oh, sure. 986 Copper Vista Drive, Prescott, Arizona, 86303. Okay. I agree with you on the process, that this is a zoning meeting or so. and that there's other aspects of this. But this whole issue you're talking about, I think it's a 3-variable equation. You've got business, you have tourism, you have history, and you have development. And I'm from the People's Republic of LA, and I can tell you that what Mr. Good just told you is very, very valid. I think in your summary comments you said this is good for the historical aspect of Prescott. I've, over the last couple of months, got to see some of your historical monuments to the 1800s. I can tell you, in Los Angeles, they have a place called Venice Beach, and it's really sort of like a lefty, hippie, bohemian neighborhood. And over the last 15 years, it's been totally changed. It has a street called Abbott Kennedy, which is now the #1 hipster neighborhood in the United States. And all the young millennials now go there and order up Uber. Maybe they don't even need a water meter because maybe they order up bottled water. And I'm sitting there in the back thinking of the Tokyo and Singapore chicken coops. And, you can really pack them in. I don't know how much you want to pack them in, but one thing about LA, even along Lincoln Boulevard, where there's been tremendous development, you will see actually your business. There will be so much business that you won't believe it, because people are living basically right over top of stores in small communities. In Pasadena, in Santa Monica, all those neighborhoods have had a lot of history to them. That history has been totally transformed. And I think what you really got to be really careful with, and again, I understand this is a process meeting, but the bigger philosophical issue is, what's your balance between these 3 variables of business, history, and development? Because once it starts, you're also, I was in my first traffic jam a few weeks ago. It was 5 cars and lasted 10 minutes. I've been in traffic jams that last 3 hours. Now, I would suspect around here, if you build these places without parking, maybe your traffic jam will last a half hour, but you will see more cars than you believe, and it won't all be Uber. So I think you should be very careful, not as a process, because like the gentleman did say, if you can't supply the water, it'll get knocked out. If you can't supply the history, it'll get knocked out. So I think it's a good process, but you're going to have to really seriously consider this, because once it starts, it's like a virus. It'll take over, because the business community will see how much money they can make. The developers will get in and do all the development. People will come here. And actually, I think the younger people do like these little compact places living over the stores, because they don't like, they're sitting in front of their computers playing games. They don't like to walk down to the store. They like to just go downstairs and get the food and come back. So that's my take on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think the question, actually, when I'm listening to the gentleman speak, not that I'm wondering why you left LA. I think I know. We're all talking about a degree here. We're talking today, we have a very, very restrictive method to calculate residential dwelling units in any area, not just downtown. Downtown is a buzzword for so many people here. I get it. And this is for downtown, but you have a very restrictive number, and I don't know that that number is the right number either. So I think the number is going to be created by the market. If there's sufficient demand, it'll get done. If there's sufficient economics, it might get done. But I don't know that this number is the right number either. 3 units on 7,500 square feet, that's a lot, or restrictive rather. So that's why I'm in favor of this. I think it's good in the long run, because I don't believe that this number is the right number. I don't believe 58 is the right number either, by the way. And I don't think it's even physically possible. Len certainly could address that better than anybody else. But thank you. Any more questions or comments from the public? Thank you. Then we'll close the public session.
Mr. Chairman, I would
Yes,
like
sir.
to just add that when we do bring this back in May, in a May meeting, for the public hearing portion of this, we will be sending out notices to many, many people, those within the downtown business district and with a boundary buffer outside of the downtown business district. So notices will go out so we can get a lot of input from people, and it will be a significant mailing given the size and boundary of the
And I
downtown
trust there'll be a significant appearance by members of the public. So thank you. Thank you all for that.
Yes, sir.
Any more comments from the commissioners on this item? We'll move on to the next item if we could.
My only point is I've owned some apartments they built in the 70s, and they're 4 units on a 7,500 square foot, and they're 1 story. They work very well, So I perhaps, and I don't know where the 58 units per acre came from. That might be too much. I mean, to go from 3 units to 9 is quite a jump, but I think it should be higher than 3.
Thank you.
Good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Do you want to take over the meeting, or are you okay? No. All right, thank you. I appreciate what Joe was just saying. We used to own a fairly large apartment complex here, and not downtown. And people thought we were pretty dense. I don't mean the management. Okay, I'm not afraid to throw up a lob pitch. And we had no recreation room, no pool. We had a little recreation laundry room, but I think we were 72 units on 3.25 acres, so it was 25 to the acre is the best we could have gotten on a modern building that people wanted to live in. So I'm not too concerned with that. The next item, we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda here, which would be, it scares me to bring this one up because these guys could talk forever. The next item on the agenda is the general engineering standards process that our engineering department has been developing to come up with a method for builders and developers and the city to regulate or to look at how we build and which standards we use. Today we've been using standards from different governments around the state. With that, we will have our chief engineer.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us today to discuss the general engineering standards. I also want to thank all the stakeholders. I want to thank the development community, Contractors Association. I'd like to recognize Sandy working very, very hard with staff as we went through this lengthy process. It's been 7 years, and I feel that after all the hard work and after all this time, we have a document that benefits everyone. There's a lot of flexibility built into it. Again, a lot of great comments from the development community. Contractor Association worked with them very closely, and I'd like to say that except for maybe one item, and I think 3 items, Andy? Except for 3 items, we're very, very close. I'm just going to jump right in. The Land Development Code is policy, and the General Engineering Standards is technical. So we're not, again, the GESs or the General Engineering Standards aren't going to tell you what is needed, but if it is needed, dictated by policy, that's where you go. For example, if you want to know how to build a sidewalk, that's where you would go. Again, I did mention all the hard work over the last 7 years, local engineers, developers, the YCCA, and also the town of Prescott Valley. They are also interested in the standards. We've been working with them. We're going to develop what's going to be called the Quad City details, which is a good thing. That a lot of positive back from the contractors. Why be different? If we can be the same in the Quad City, it makes a lot of sense. If we can standardize, there's efficiencies built into that. Just really quickly, the GSs is broken down into 10 articles: the introduction, grading, drainage, water, wastewater, transportation and traffic, dry utilities, survey, alterations and modifications, record drawings, as-built, and again, we did talk, and then also the standard details. No, I'm not going to go through all 10 articles, but pretty much highlight some of the more active, I guess, topics. Well, the one topic was a little bit of concern about the rubber gasket reinforced concrete pipe, RGRCP. We know it's a very good product. We know we also know that it's a little bit more expensive. We know that CMP, we've experienced a lot of failures. That after a very short few years, CMP basically starts to rot out. There's a picture there, kind of shows it starts to rot out. It collapses. City needs to jump in, replace the pipe, redo the roadway. Very expensive. Now, originally, the city wanted the concrete pipe, but by working with with the contractors and developers, we are going to allow alternative piping. Not CMP, but we will allow what's the high-density polyethylene pipe. Very cost-effective, and if it's installed correctly, it can work. So I feel that we did reach agreement on that topic. The other one that there was concerns was the PVC pipe. Again, we have a long history of plastic pipe failure. I'm not stating that it's not a great product. I don't want to say that it doesn't last. We had a gentleman from the PVC pipe industry come to talk to the UDC. Again, it's a great product, but it's not the right product for Prescott. I want to point out the water distribution system here in Prescott is complicated. It has high pressures, and it's rocky. And when we look at, and we're not forensic scientists, we don't have the resources, but when you keep on, for one reason or another, you keep on seeing failures, and it seems to be plastic pipe, well, for one or other reason, it's not as forgivable as ductile iron pipe. However, at the last meeting of the UDC, we did, again, working with all the stakeholders, agreed that we would consider it on a case-by-case, by a project-by-project basis. If they can demonstrate that it's an equal, then we'll entertain it, and we don't have a problem with that.
Okay, clarify.
Yes.
The first piping they were talking about was for culverts. The one that compromise was made, where he said that certain piping is going to be allowed, that was for culverts. This is for water mains, mainly on public right-of-way and public projects.
That's correct.
And one of the other things I think that was stressed in the UDC meeting was the fact that although some of the failures were through the pressures that our high pressure water system or delivery system causes, is that the installation was below standards, let's say, by whoever the contractor was putting in the shading material and throwing the bones of a rocky trench right on top of a PVC pipe, and then a 3-inch piece of rock burrows its way through the pressure over the years and breaks the pipe. So a lot of it is going to be education on the part of everybody, especially the contractors in the area, about how you got to get the right shading and material in if you're going to use PVC pipe, because it just fails when it doesn't have the proper shading.
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct.
And it's hard to try to legislate incompetence.
I might interject here for the few people that aren't from the engineering department. We have 3 members of this panel that I think sat on the UDC, so they're very familiar with the input. There's a couple of us that aren't quite as familiar, but sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, just let me clarify that too. The code committee, the UDC is the code committee, Uniform Code Committee, and we take a look at all code changes in the city before it comes to Planning Commission and then before it goes to City Council. And so we held 3 different meetings with the public in attendance, quite a bit of the public in attendance, and then of course Public Works, and they presented everything. And so for 3 different public meetings, we kind of hashed out practically everything, item by item that we could. The one issue that didn't seem to be resolved by Mr. Fan came and spoke, and some other developers spoke, and the one issue was the water main piping. and that didn't seem to get to get solved or compromised. So that's why the discussion is leaning so much on this water piping, because it's really the major item that wasn't resolved completely.
That's correct. I mean, there was a lot of, again, based on our past experience, based upon the past expense for the city to go back in there. And again, anytime there's a water line break, that there's a public safety concern there too. We don't want our water lines breaking. And I do want to point out the high pressures that we have here. I want to point out the rocky soil that we have too. And again, the long history we have with both materials. And I know that Mr. Craig Dotsett is here, our utilities manager. He's willing to speak a little bit more in detail as needed. We're not saying plastic's a bad product. We're saying it's not the product for Prescott. However, with that said, I think one of the things we heard is, well, if we come across an area that, we can prove to you that we have the right shading, we have the right backfill, we'll make sure we have enough inspectors to actually watch it carefully. Will you consider it? Yes, we'll consider it. And that has been written into, or will be written into the document. So it does provide for flexibility.
Continue with your presentation. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Here basically is a chart basically looking at the different type of roadway sections, as has the new detail, the old detail. Basically local residential is going to be 50 feet of roadway width for a residential collector, 60, commercial industrial 70, minor arterial 100, major arterial 120. So one of the things that we try to do, we try to make sure that our lanes are wide enough, but not, we're also sensitive to the fact that as we develop here, we want to be sensitive to making sure that we don't ask for more rights of way than we need to basically for vehicular traffic.
Were there any change in these standards? I mean, over the last few years?
I believe yes, there were. And
in terms of road widths and right-of-ways?
The city's traffic engineer is here. I'm going to invite him up here.
Okay.
I do have a question about this 12-foot trail. What is that? Is that new?
Morning. Ian Mattingly, City Traffic Engineer. Yeah, there were some changes. We previously had more standards than this. We had major and minor collectors that were pretty much repetitive. They were separate in the sense that they were classified as a different type of roadway, but really when you went to build them, they had identical right-of-way widths and lane widths and number of lanes. So we pared this down from about 7 roadway typical sections to the 5. There are slight variations in how we do on-street bike lanes. So previously, all our large arterials, minor arterials and major arterials, had bike lanes on street. Through the years of discussing bicycle facilities with council, with advocates and others, we've heard a desire to consider off-street shared use or multi-use trails. And so that's what you're seeing on these minor arterials, where we're no longer using the 10 feet of pavement in the roadway, 5 feet of bike lane on each side, and we've taken that and put that in the right-of-way off the street in a multi-use trail. And so I think we discussed this in one of the meetings. We have discussed the fact that overall, the prism of the roadway, actually, there's no more pavement or hard surface for the contractor to build or ourselves to build. It's just that we've taken it from the roadway and put it, behind the curb. And so that's what we've done. That's why we've got the 12-foot multi-use trail. It's 12 feet because that's the width that's most useful for combined bicycle and pedestrian use. And it also is, if you notice, 5-foot sidewalk on one side, 12-foot multi-use on the other, and that bypasses the the old 5-foot sidewalk that was also required. So when you look at it, you had 5 feet of concrete and 10 feet of asphalt in the old standards, replaced with one 12-foot multi-use path. So overall, it's a deletion of 3 feet. That's my answer on the multi-use.
But there's still some case by case, I believe, isn't there, such as there's a Center Point South where they were going to still have a bike lane to connect between the Constellation Trails and over to Center Point East, and so when these come to planning and zoning, we don't have to exactly use these 5, do we? I mean, we can have a case-by-case basis where there's a particular need that isn't met by one of these. They still want to keep the residential look with the sidewalks, but then they still want to have a way to get through that too for the non-residents.
Yeah, certainly we'd be flexible in the design of roadways. There's examples where we already have an arterial that's being extended. It has bike lanes or it has sidewalk, and certainly we can match existing things. It's just going forward in open new areas, like especially near the airport, in areas that aren't developed. We'd like to move towards using the multi-use trail in those areas, especially on high-speed roadways. And that's, in all cases, in everything we've talked about, infill and in existing subdivisions, things like that, there's always flexibility to use standards. And again, Center Point South, some of those, these are new standards. So we haven't implemented many of these and they're not adopted yet. So we're still working off our old, ones with the bike lanes on the roadway.
So the multi-use trail can be a bike path.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, it would basically take the bikes that are now using the bike lanes, that we've heard some concern over those being used on high-speed roadways, and take them off and put them on, behind the curb in a parkway, basically.
Thank you. I think that piece alone is a great addition. I remember we had a hearing with the bike people and the bike paths, and I, for one, sat here saying I'd probably violate the law and ride on my bike on the sidewalk instead of Willow Creek Road. That was it's a death trap. So I think something like this is just great.
ATV users will love it.
Oh, well.
What, is the paving material limited to concrete, or can it be DG, or?
It sure isn't limited. We've written in the actual narrative, we've written it such that they can use a hard surface suitable for pedestrians and bicycles, whatever that means, because that's the federal standard. If you look at the bike and ped design guidebooks, they don't limit it to asphalt or concrete. So it can be whatever material would be suitable.
Well, Prescott Valley has an extensive use of these, and they use it to supplement their construction costs for their actual roads, because they go after a federal grant for a multi-use path, and then they don't have to cover the sidewalk and the pedestrian traffic as part of their road project. So it can be a financial advantage on projects here if we go that direction.
Yep.
Ian, thank you very much.
Sure, thanks.
And I'm going to, with that said,
So Charles is going to pass the baton. I'm Gwen Roach, Public Works Analyst. When we went to the UDC committee the first time, Chairman Menzner asked me, well, we're a land use committee, why are you bringing us engineering standards? So for the benefit of the entire commission, I'll just tell you that many of the requirements that are in the general engineering standards, portions of them were in the Land Development Code, and so we'll be modifying the Land Development Code to accommodate the adoption of the general engineering standards. In the staff report that we gave to you, those items were listed out specifically. I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of them. Access management is in the general engineering standards in Chapter 6. Drainage, floodplains, and drainage ways is in Chapter 3. Grading and restoration is now in Chapter 2. In Article 7, under subdivision and land split standards, a couple of major things to note. The way that the Land Development Code is currently written, Council can waive requirements to the subdivision code, which they still can do by policy. However, requirements of the general engineering standards, we have a different waiver system, if you will. It's called alterations and modifications in Chapter 9. Because those are technical things, and so they're reviewed by a technical group, and I can go over that with you if you would like. Also, we've deleted references to the YAG standards. YAG was adopted in 1998. The committee has been inactive.
Could you tell the public what YAG is?
I'm sorry, Yavapai Association of Governments.
Which is similar to what Phoenix has with Maricopa.
They have a Maricopa Association of Governments, that's correct. The YAG committee hasn't been active for quite some time, and so we've deleted references to the YAG standards, and we have adopted, as Charles indicated, or we will be hopefully adopting, the Quad City standards, which we did in partnership in the area. As Ian mentioned, there's a new street classification table that is in the Land Development Code, and it will remain in the Land Development Code. Sidewalks, bikeways, and multi-use paths, Ian has spoken with you already. Location and placement of streetlights, that's now in the General Engineering Standards, Chapter 6. And financial assurances will be moving from the Land Development Code to the General Engineering Standards, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. Article 9 of the Land Development Code has to do with procedures and how different types of activities go through the process here at the city. So there are a few modifications to the grading permit section. The subdivision and plat review checklist has been expanded to include a few additional items such as survey boundary, and electronic survey datum was moved to the General Engineering Standards in Chapter 8. Additionally, as we went through the codes, it was interesting to me how many times the same definition would appear in both the city code, different chapters, as well as the Land Development Code, as well as the GES. So I attempted to do a little bit of cleanup so that definitions were consistent and applicable to today's standards. Financial assurances are something that is basically a guarantee of completion of work by a contractor. The requirement for financial assurances has historically been in Article 7 of the Land Development Code under subdivision requirements because, as a general rule, that's where most public improvements occur. There are several other portions of the Land Development Code that require financial assurance, activities such as bank stabilization, permanent stabilization, grading, and for some commercial single-site improvements, there can be an extensive amount of public improvement, such as water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, and so on. Those assurances are always based on the engineer of record's cost estimate for the work for the public improvement, and they never have an expiration date. As I mentioned, it's applicable to non-residential single-site development, subdivisions and land splits, grading, bank stabilization, and hillside development. All financial assurances have a contingency for unknowns. 10% is withheld for all projects until the completion of the project. And when erosion and sediment controls or permanent stabilization, in other words, if you cut the side of a hill and it needs to be revegetated, sometimes it can take quite a while in our arid climate in order for that vegetation to permanently stabilize. We require an additional 10% contingency for that.
Gwen,
Yes.
if I can clarify from my own knowledge, are we taking the financial assurances out of the Land Development Code?
We are not removing the language that says that they are required in different instances. In other words, grading is in Chapter 6 of the Land Development Code, subdivisions are in Chapter 7. We still reference that a financial assurance is required per the General Engineering Standards, Section 1.4. But yes, we are moving it into the General Engineering Standards because those assurances are always related to activities that are listed in the General Engineering Standards.
So the financial piece of that falls under the engineering department?
It does. Financial assurances are always collected and monitored as part of public improvement development activity, which is done in the Public Works Department.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, as a staff member that has in the past administered financial assurances, I can tell you that There was not a lot of flexibility within the way that the code was written, and so one of the things we wanted to do is have some exemptions to financial assurances. They are costly to developers, and sometimes it can delay a project just in the process of procuring a financial assurance. So single-family residential lots are always exempt from financial assurances. But we wanted to put in a caveat for projects that have a value of work that is less than $20,000, where a contractor already has a performance bond in place of at least $12,500. In a lot of cases, especially on smaller grading projects, or if someone's just installing a fire line, they could fall under this exemption and a financial assurance would not be needed.
One thing, in the LDC, single family and duplexes are considered the same.
That is correct.
Why aren't you considering duplexes as a exemption?
By definition, a duplex is an attached single family unit, so it would be exempt as well.
Okay.
I mean, a duplex might share a parcel, whereas a single family attached is its own parcel, so there is a difference there.
But the code considers them the same?
Again,
usually?
if the improvements are under $20,000, they would still be exempt.
Okay.
And in most cases, that is the case. There are several, did you have another question, Ken?
I'll ask later. Thank you.
Okay. There are many forms of assurances. A performance bond is something that is posted by an insurance company guaranteeing performance of the work. Trust agreements, unconditional guarantees from a bank, and cash are also very common. We wanted to have some flexibility in this financial assurances. When we went through the downturn of the economy, people had to get very creative about how they posted financial assurances and how they were just financing projects in general. And so we added an other category here, and you'll note in the language that any form of assurance that is approved by the legal department will be considered. All projects warranty for a 2-year period, and that will not change. That's part of the financial assurance. Are there questions about financial assurances?
Well, yes. I'm not sure why the engineering department is involved in the decisions in reference to that. I can appreciate the engineering department involved in determining cost of things.
I think that as a contractor developer, it's on off-site improvements that are necessary for the project, and Public Works comes in.
So I appreciate that.
That's basically what it
And they're involved in the cost estimate.
And the cost estimate. But the
So-
decisions as to what the financial assurance just baffles me why it would be an engineering department issue. I think more of a legal and a business side of the...
All financial assurances are approved by the legal department, but they have to be managed.
Okay.
A lot of these other forms, other than the performance bond, they typically will draw down on the assurance as progress of the project continues. That's done through our inspection department, our city engineer, and the Public Works director.
Thank you. I think you clarified it for me.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's the end of the presentation, unless you have questions.
Thank you, Gwen. I would know there's a couple of stakeholders here that I sure would like to hear from in reference to this. I know the three gentlemen on either side of me here that attended all these meetings know this so much better. I see a contractor back there and Sandy Griffins from the Yavapai Contractors Association. I think it might be helpful for the public who might be watching to hear what some of the comments were.
Sandy Griffiths, Yavapai County Contractors Association. Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, Commission members.
Good morning.
This indeed has been a long road bringing you the GES standards before you this morning. I think much longer than Public Works staff ever imagined, but we are at the end. And I have been so embedded in this review and rework that instead of answering my telephone, "Good morning, YCCA," for about a 2-week period, maybe even a 3-week period, I was answering the phone, "Good morning, RGRCP, this is HDPE. How may I help you, CMP?" What's with that? And then every now and then somebody would call and ask for PVC. Let me tell you, I got it down, Henry. I mean, I thank you to Public Works for being so receptive and open-minded to create a document that is not a controlling document. This document has made some very valuable, worthwhile changes based on industry input, based on input from our local developers and our local engineering representatives. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, and we have been working diligently on this. And again, I know more than I ever want to know about general engineering standards. And Henry and his team, again, to add a little more levity to this very serious process, Henry and his team we've been attempting to get to 100%. Commission member Mincer and Mr. Scarmato and Mr. Sheets know that as well through the UDC conversations. And Henry, I have a presentation for you. You know, I appreciate you and your hard work.
Wow, thank you. It's very, very nice.
It says 99.999%. So we have 3 items. Our engineer, Charles, talked about those this morning, that we are reworking some verbiage for the water pipe material, for the culvert material, and the mailboxes. We have not seen that yet, so therefore the 99.999%. We will have 100% celebration. And again, one size does not fit all. And again, it's a case-by-case basis for this applicable material. We need to do our part as the industry, as the developers, and as Public Works to ensure that we are putting in the applicable material, installing it correctly. And there is some education that needs to take place on both sides to make this work, which is going to make the city of Prescott even better than we already are for our culverts and water lines. So again, I thank you. I would appreciate and hope that you would move this forward based on the promise that we will have changes to 3 items with yet to be approved verbiage, but I don't anticipate any problems. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
I've not been involved in this to any great degree, but I've watched it from somewhat of a distance. And I know there was one section that dealt with appeals as a section 14.
9. See, I know it. 9.
Whatever section dealt with how do you come back and say, wait a minute, this doesn't fit here?
And that was something that we brought up. This standard book had a lot of assumptions in it that everybody's going to assume how it works. And the Public Works staff, they made applicable changes to that and brought in some additional information, I feel, that made it much clearer to the industry on your appeal process and what you can do.
Can I add to that, Sandy? And I think the work that you did and the staff did in the Unified Development Committee, what we worked for was flexibility, and we've got flexibility, and that was really one of the satisfying requirements from the UDC, that there was flexibility to this, and it wasn't written on page 18 and you will do it or we'll have you shot in the morning. So there is flexibility built into the plan. And the flexibility was something that all of us were looking to get.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. And I felt that this relationship of working together brought Public Works into our purview where they could see where we were coming from, and without hesitation, it brought us into their daily life and what they go through. And I do want to say I am totally humbled by working with this team and this staff. I mean, and totally honored as well. So it was a great process. And Henry's 100% will be coming.
Thank you. George, you had a question?
Well, you know, the
Was that
term,
for Sandy?
Yes, for Sandy, the flexibility and then appeal process, those don't really exactly match. I'm assuming that flexibility exists in terms of if a plan is presented to engineering and it may be different than what's in the standards, they may or may not approve it. If they do not approve it, then that's the point of the appeal process, that there would be flexibility prior to the appeal process.
Yes. Now, and I do want to say, before this process, I am speaking for the industry. I felt that they were under the impression that this was not an open door situation. It was cut and dry, and this is the way it's going to be. Our way, the highway, no, everything is controlled and we work in this box. I really feel that by us working together, seeing both sides, we're now all out-of-box thinkers, and that's where the flexibility comes in from Mr. Sheets. So I'm pleased. We have all learned from one another.
Thank you. You know, as I listen to this, my background doesn't fall into any of those fields. I work with the engineering department quite a bit, and I've had a lot of great success, and we've got some great people in our engineering department. And I think one of the things that has
That's
happened...
not what you told me.
That's not what I said before today. It's not been easy. And a lot of it is because there's some guidelines in the engineering department that the guys need to follow, and they don't necessarily have, from my experience, a mechanism to appeal. And that's why I'm so concerned about the appeal process. I think we have some good guys here. Charles and I are discussing something right now, which is kind of a quasi-appeal. But when I look at this program, I'm not looking at it from a contractor's perspective, nor from the engineer's perspective. I'm looking at it from the developer-owner perspective, who's really, in some cases, the guy that's caught in the middle. Because if you've got a situation that engineering says this, you have a lot of people on the contractor side that really don't have an investment as to which way it goes. The developer does in many cases. So that's why the appeal process is probably more for the owner-developer purposes than almost anything else. And I'm just glad that you're comfortable
I think,
with that.
Ken, when you talk about owner-developer, you should also add to your owner-developer the fact that you have, as an owner-developer, hired some professionals, and you've hired professional engineers. And it's those professional engineers that stamp the plans and have the liability that should have some say in the negotiating process with the city engineers as to usage and design and so forth. And they shouldn't let a two-year student at Yavapai College who is now working for the engineering department make policy.
I agree. 100%.
They have no liability. The architect, like Tom's license, my partners are all public engineers. They stamp those plans, and they have a tremendous amount of liability because they are, in terms of the state's eyes and the public and the courts, the person who is legally responsible for the ongoing safety and correctness of the plans and the design. And the unlicensed individual who does not have the liability should not have the majority of the say.
I would agree with that. Any other comment? Mr. Devereaux.
Hey guys, Chairman, members. I was here a couple of weeks ago. Kenny wasn't here, but a bunch of you were anyway, and had some concerns, and I addressed them. And Apparently they made some sense because I met immediately after with Henry and Charles and Steve and Craig, and they were all over them. I mean, I pointed out that if these were just etched in stone in the box, as Sandy says, half the subdivisions in this town could have never been built, including any of mine. So these guys have been great about talking out these problems and making it more flexible, as we've been talking about. Basically, everything I got up here to say has already been said between Sandy and Len and Ken. But I just want to say I appreciate what these guys have done. I think it's great, especially in Craig's world, where things need to last for a long, long time. And I appreciate, because I've been involved in every bit of this, except I'm not a registered engineer. But I've done a lot of out in the woods engineering, and I realized how hard it was to get this thing tacked down so that it made sense and also allows us to move forward in Prescott and leave Prescott looking like it does now and not like a airport. And I also want to mention that since all these guys got on board and the new engineering department people, and I've dealt with several different regimes, both in contracting and in development. It's easy to get a hold of them. It's easy to have a meeting. The right people always show up at the meetings. It's taken a whole bunch of pain over the last 2 years. It's taken a whole bunch of pain out of the process of getting your plans approved and being able to actually go to work, and having the flexibility to not let a street light hang up the fact that we could be putting sewer in the ground, which is what goes first. So my hat's off to these guys. I know they all appreciate being at the end of the road. I wasn't involved in the process until I let everyone else do all the work, and I only had a few problems left at the end and came.
You got your Tommy.
I know. I'm too hands-on. I don't have time. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to tell these guys that I appreciate their hard work, and I'm happy with the outcome. And certainly not like Sandy. I'm not a representative of all the developers and contractors in town, but I've been doing it a long time, and I've been through a lot of different regimes of people, and these guys have been great.
I think we need your name and address.
Oh, Tom Devereaux. I live at 1153 Linwood Avenue in Prescott.
Thank you, Tom.
You bet.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to be really reading these things really closely, and it's the folks here did probably a really fantastic job. 8 years or 7 years? That's a lot of time. But unfortunately for me, it sort of slapped me right out of the box on the first slide. PVC is not good for Prescott from the get-go, but if you have a design, we will consider it. I think that's a little extreme. You know, any good design, if it's not implemented correctly, it's going to fail. And what I saw there is that PVC is more susceptible to water hammer and burst pressure. Well, if I got a burst pressure of X and I put a margin on it, and then I take and implement a PVC with X over 2, why sure, it's going to fail. Or if I put reinforced concrete there with X over 3, it's going to fail too. And I remember when I looked at some tables for PVC, it was the design, it was the diameter to the thickness and blah, blah, blah. And I think you're being over restrictive on your PVC there. It looks like some anecdotal foolishness or some bad designs are now going to be implemented in your design standards. And I think that's a little bit not right. And another thing on the flexibility, when I hear flexibility, that's usually fuzzy thinking. I like things that are really like clear cut. Your lawyer here will probably tell you that a requirement is a shall, and a will is a statement of intent. And I suspect, your boards will adjudicate the requirements. So I like to have requirements stated pretty clear and concise, because if I meet them, I meet them. If I don't meet them, well, okay, I'm out of compliance. And then we can argue on the wills, which are usually interfaces. So I really appreciate all the work you've done on your general engineering standards, and I'll be reading them, to come up on them. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I just that first slide just, wow, that just hit me. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to point out that Prescott has a lot of different terrains, and what could fit in one lot may not fit in another lot. We have, I'm real familiar with some rocky, very rocky, 100% rocky terrain. And then we have other areas that are just very loamy and sandy and whatnot. So I don't know this stuff, and I pay very little attention to the details, such as you did, sir. But I'm hopeful that that's the concept as to the variable and the flexibility in this. 'Cause the terrain is such a major issue in Prescott that I think flexibility is required. The only other comment I have, I think it's a great thing that we have some standard. I was so pleased to hear that you're reaching out to the other communities so that everybody's under maybe not the same standard, but a much more similar standard than we had in the past. That has a big effect from the business side of the components too. So thank you for doing that type of thing, Charles. Appreciate that. Yes, sir, Mr. Hash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't planning to talk, I think, but I must say that I was quite honored and humbled to hear from Sandy and Tom, some of the people who have done so much for our city and have so much interest for our city. So I want to thank you. We really tried hard because they understand, as they say, they get it. I hope that we given a clear message to you and the UDC board and hopefully to our council that we also get it. Some of us are new. We realize the city of Prescott, we're all here because we love it. It's such a wonderful city with its own character. It's different than some of the cities perhaps in California or in the East Coast that are built fairly new, all the same. One size really does apply to all. Not in Prescott. We understand. We love the character. We love the hilly part, the rockiness. That's why we built flexibility. So to put everybody in. Sandy has done so much, really. She has spent dozens, maybe hundreds of hours to go through all of this, made our job easier, and to read some of this. The process became complicated because she talked to all the stakeholders much longer than we thought, not necessarily as smooth, as easier than Public Works originally anticipated. But I must admit, the document before you is a completely different document that we started with, but it's a much better document. This is something that would serve the city for a long time. This has been worked with with my 3 directors, 8 years, something we needed, didn't go through. I am so pleased that to see we're almost there. I want to thank really all of you for being so patient with us. I want to thank the UDC board, which includes our council member, being so understanding and patient, and Chairman Mansur, a lot of good suggestions, good guidance. And here we are. If I may, I really would like to thank so many people because 8 years is such a long time for something we've been needing. Our legal, John and Matt. John left. They have been so much. Tom and George and Frank and Randy, our community development. They've been wonderful. And of course, the best group we have in the entire public works in all the nation, right here sitting. And I am willing to put my money on it that they are the best. So I want to thank you again. I hope you agree to move this forward to our city council, and we can't wait for the day that this is approved.
I think
thank you.
Informative. Thank you, Henry. Appreciate that. And we're all going to stand up and sing Kumbaya. Frank.
Yes, sir.
George. Do we vote on this, or is this just an update to us?
You can vote on it today, yes.
Okay.
But let's close the public hearing.
I'll make a motion.
Not that we opened it. Do we have a motion to approve, disapprove, or suspend the recommendation to the general engineer?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion.
Yes, sir.
Make a motion that we move the general engineering standards onto the city council for final action with the condition that the 3 redrafted Issues are specifically noted in the staff report to the City Council.
I'll second that.
We have a motion, we have a second. Any discussion? I'll call for a vote. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Recommendation to send it on to council. Thank you all very much, engineering and Sandy and Tom and everybody else that partook in this lengthy process. Thank you so much. We're going to move on. Someone needs a break. So we'll be taking a mensa break here for 15 minutes.
No,
join back. 5 minutes. And join back here. Thank you.
Take mine, you were late.
You walk in.
My timing went off.
At 10:30.
No, you always take a break at 10:30.
My timing went off. I had to take mine.
An hour and a half is long enough.
So sorry about that. The next item on our agenda is the public hearing regarding amendments to the LDC, mostly and primarily dealing with signs and right-of-ways and some new sign regulations. So, George, with that, we'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Specifically today, we're talking about signs on private property and primarily commercial properties in town. There are a number of reasons why signs have come up recently as an issue for many communities across the country. Primarily, Supreme Court decision last year that reaffirmed something they had done many years ago, but had been misinterpreted to some degree by some of the district courts. That is, regulation of signage is a regulation of free speech, and you can't do it based on the content of the speech. So the content of the sign can't be used to regulate the sign. You can use other criteria. And in most cities' cases, there's some content level of regulation associated with signs. If you regulate a real estate sign different than you regulate a typical business sign or a political sign, you're doing it because of the content of the sign. It's a real estate sign. That's content-based. So we've gone through our code. The planning department worked with the legal department, and we went through pretty thoroughly and identified all those areas where we may have slipped one way or the other across that boundary of content rather than typical requirements that are acceptable under the Constitution, under Supreme Court decisions and interpretations in the past. So we've made an effort to go back and remove those content-based aspects of the code. In the process of doing that, we identified so many changes that we looked at the possibility of some greater change to perhaps even conceptual changes to the way we do sign regulations. And we looked at a number of model codes that are put out by the sign industry themselves and by the legal industry and by the planning industry. I'm not sure if you want to call them industries or not, but each of those groups have produced model sign codes over the years, and many of them reproduce those sign codes in an effort to make sure that their model code conform to the Supreme Court's most recent decision on Reed versus Gilbert. So we got those newest model codes and we took a look at how they proposed regulating signage, and it came down to a couple of major categories that we want to look at, and I'm going to go through those just briefly with you. There are two types of signs, those that are permanent and those that are temporary. Of those that are permanent, there are also two types of signs, those that stand up by themselves and those that are attached to the buildings. So we've separated out the proposal to you to address those things. They do different things for the business depending on whether they're freestanding or attached to the building. Freestanding signs generally are focused on vehicular traffic. They're out on the street. They're intending to identify the location of the business so that a driver knows where to turn to get to that business. Once they're on the property, once they've gotten off of the street into the parking lot or into the driveway of the property, the signs on the building now identify where the business is located to the person. So there are two different criteria that can be applied to those signs, the freestanding versus building signage. If you're trying to attract attention of someone who's on the road, then the speed of traffic has a big component, plays a big component in determining what and how large and where signage could be and should be. So we've proposed to you the concept that freestanding signs should be regulated based on the speed limit of the frontage street. So if you have a very fast speed on a street, larger signs are more appropriate because it allows a driver to see, understand what's on the sign, and make a decision from further away. They're able to see it from further away, and therefore they can make those decisions in the same time frame. Well, if it takes you a second and a half to identify the sign, decide to turn, and you're doing 55 miles an hour, you need more space than if you're doing 25 miles an hour. The time it takes a driver to actually make the determination to that it's the business he's looking for and to decide that he's turning is the same regardless of speed. The speed is strictly a distance measurement issue at that point. So the faster the speed limits, the larger the signs should be. So we've given you some criteria that sort of promotes that. The idea is that if you've got a speed limit of up to 25 miles per hour, that's very slow speeds, that's downtown speeds. Those speeds allow you much greater opportunity to restrict the sign and still make it easily visible and still make it very useful for both the business and the customer who's driving to that location. If you have a 55 mile per hour speed limit, the larger sign is necessary to give the driver, the customer, more time to make his decision or more distance in order to actually enact his decision once he's decided where he's going to go. The distance from the entrance of the property to the building then becomes the second part of it. Building signage at that point isn't being controlled by the speed, because once you've pulled onto the property, your speed is 10 miles per hour or 15 miles per hour in most cases. You're not talking about a time to determine. Now it's strictly an identification. Further away you are, the harder the sign is to read. It's strictly a distance measurement again, but this one is from a presumably or nearly fixed position for the customer. If your business is 100 feet away from the property line, larger signage may be appropriate than if your business is 10 feet from the property line or 10 feet from the point where your customer is on your property and actually looking at your sign. There are some unusual circumstances that come into play that affect businesses, and the downtown is a good example of that. There really aren't any freestanding signs in the immediate downtown. As you get away from the courthouse plaza, that starts to occur. Those signs are also limited by the speed of traffic in the proposal you have before you, and they're approximately equivalent to having a business very close to a property line and regulating the signage that way. So we think we've covered it adequately. And in most cases, because we started with model codes and not necessarily worked from what we started with on our own in the land development code, the current requirements, the signage sizes go up slightly for most of the categories, especially for freestanding signs. The one specific place where it may come down somewhat is building signage if the buildings are immediately on the property line. They will be smaller because the need for a larger sign goes away under the criteria used by these model codes and the ones that we followed in coming up with this proposal. The other area of signage, a larger category of signage, are temporary signs. And they generally, in most cases, fall into two categories, those on commercial property and those on residential property. Commercial property typically has some additional regulation applied to it for freestanding signs for temporary uses. They do under our current code. Nearly every city in the country has some kind of sign regulation to prevent a proliferation of those types of signs, because businesses have more use for those signs typically than single-family residential properties. You can have a sale sign, you can have an hour sign, you can have grand opening signs. They're all potentially more signage available for them. So the proposal, similar to what we already have on the books in the LDC, is to limit those signs. So there are limitations on the size and the number of those signs that are not proposed for residential properties. Generally for residential properties, the types of messages that a private property owner is going to put out are going to be limited to a couple of categories. They want to sell their property, they're doing something like having a garage sale, or they're expressing political positions. Limitations on those types of signs can be very dangerous. They can violate the free speech provisions of code. We couldn't say you're allowed 2 political signs in your front yard and have 5 political offices on the ballot that year.
Okay.
We're forcing someone to defer or not express a political position which they have a First Amendment right to by limiting the number of those signs. Those are the types of things that we shied away from, and most communities shy away from after the Gilbert decisions, or the Gilbert versus Reed decision. We are looking for regulation of those signs that are appropriate to regulate and deregulation of signs that are inappropriate to regulate. Our current code applies rather strict standards to what you can put up on your private property, especially on your private residential property. The intention there is to not clutter up a neighborhood, but at the same time, who here would like to go and tell someone that they're allowed 2 signs in their yard and all of the other candidates they support, they can't express that support? So we've certainly shied far away from that. And again, that is a trend across the country to pull back from those types of things in most communities, especially following the Supreme Court decision on Reed versus Gilbert.
Well, you're not limiting the number of signs on residential property, but
we do propose to limit the size of those signs.
The size of the sign, yeah. What about the length of time?
Length of time is another issue that's very difficult for us to address for residential properties. So we're not proposing to limit them to a 2-month period or a 3-month period. And you'll see our descriptions of each of those. The staff report had each of those categories that I've just mentioned broken down with a little bit more detail. The intent was to limit the types of signs, the locations of signs, and in some cases, the manner that those signs are placed or displayed. Yeah. You can limit a sign on residential property to not place it in a location that's going to cause a hazard, visibility issue, or a hazard for pedestrians. You can do those types of things very easily, and we are proposing that in here.
George, I think I'd like to have you clarify that in the UDC, of which Councilman Lamerson is also a member, we made a very distinct decision that when we're dealing with the sign issue, we're dealing with 2 categories. The signs within the public right-of-way, we can have all kinds of regulation as to what we want and don't right when they're in the public right-of-way. But then when they're on private property, we have less and less of the authority to make changes to what a person's right to do is on his own property.
That's
Jim,
correct.
Does that reiterate your position? And yours and mine and some of the other members were the same, that we were strongly in favor of regulating signs that went in public right-of-way, but we were not in the same position and the same thinking when it came to private property.
In the public right-of-way, because it belongs to all the public, not to just a guy with a sign, you have to be very cautious on picking and choosing. It's all or none. It's not, we're going to allow some of this and none of that. I remember that part of the discussion in UDC, and it was our recommendation at that point in time, you treat them all the same. It's either no of this or all of this, but not some of this and some of this and some of this in public right-of-way. Private property is a different issue. A private citizen has a right on their private property to do what they choose.
Yeah, and that was what my point was. There's a major difference between public property and what we can allow to do and how we can restrict certain uses, and the private property, which is a no-no.
Okay. That's correct. And our regulations are considerably varied between those two.
I see our attorney getting to the front of his seat. Did we step on something?
The City Council has already taken action on the right-of-way signage, so this is This is private property signage we're talking about
If
today.
I can, Mr. Chairman and Commission, just some clarification. The right-of-way
Could you
issue...
give us your full name?
No, I decline. The right-of-way issue is resolved. We have an ordinance in place, and for all intents and purposes, the city prohibits temporary signage in the right-of-way, regardless of the content. We just ban it outright. We have the Supreme Court case to say we can do that, so we followed that route. The private property signage, and I think the commercial is different than the residential side of it. What's proposed for residential signage is objective measurements. In other words, it's not content-based or subjective-based on allowing, say, for instance, ideological or political or religious signage and banning commercial signage on single-family residential, for instance, or multifamily residential, because commercial signage is allowed on single-family residential if you put a real estate sign. That's commercial. Or if you have a duplex or an apartment complex, for rent signs are commercial signage. We don't regulate the content. So hypothetically, someone could put a sign, as long as it complies with these objective criteria, on their single-family home advertising Budweiser. Because the Supreme Court cases have said you can't really regulate commercial or content-based. Now, that's not absolutely clear based on Reed versus Gilbert. I think that we still have zoning authority, but the problem is if we were to say no commercial signage on residential property, we would effectively have to ban then real estate signs. So, and I would argue or contend that there is some flexibility to do that, to allow for that. But as a practical matter, I don't think that's a workable solution to say we're banning all commercial signage, which means you'd have to ban real estate for sale signs, for rent signs, those kinds of things. So by allowing for real estate signs, I don't think we can distinguish between this commercial speech, real estate signs, and other commercial speech. So the criteria is, for instance, on a wall, I think it's wall mounted in residential, there is a limit. There's one sign, I think 6 square feet, that may be allowed on as a wall sign. But yard signs, it's strictly objective criteria. So hypothetically, someone could put in 14 or 15 different political signs, a couple of real estate signs, and then a couple of go to the rodeo signs.
And leave them there all year round.
And leave them there year round.
Well, the problem with time frames is, there is some flexibility on time limits for signage, for temporary signs. The challenge is if you impose time limits on temporary signs, again, you can't base those on content. So you'd have to have it across the board.
And how do you enforce it?
Well,
The enforcement becomes a real issue with the more regulation you have.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I think when we talk about that's always a question when you're adopting any kind of legislation is the enforcement issue. But we try not to let the tail wag the dog on that. I mean, enforcement is what it is. The regulation is the standard. Can you enforce every single law on the book? Well, certainly not, because does everybody going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit get pulled over and get a ticket? Clearly not. So it's the same kind of argument. Why have a speed limit if you can't enforce it against everybody? That's just not practical. Same with sign regulation. If you're going to have regulations, are you going to enforce it? Well, sure. Can you enforce it against 100% of the population? Not likely. I mean, it's just not a practical answer. But time limits could be allowed, but in discussions, it does become kind of a practical issue in terms of how you define the time limit. Can you have a maximum square footage? I think
we didn't propose that.
We didn't propose it. You could, I think, in terms of you can have your maximum sign. Each sign can only be 6 square feet? Temporary sign. You could say no more than 30 square feet of signage, because I think the law would allow you to say one of the things when you're doing this First Amendment analysis is are there alternative means or alternative measures? And if you say you can have 30 square feet total, no more than 6 apiece, of temporary signs in your yard signs on a residential lot, then the speaker gets to pick and choose what speech he or she wants to do. And that's, again, it's an objective criteria. We're not telling you you can only have 4 political signs and 2 real estate signs. We're telling you can have X number of signs. And the fact of the matter is if you don't want to go 6 square feet and you can go 3 square feet, well, then you get 10 signs. I mean, so you can do that. It's not being suggested here, but it's certainly something that the Commission and Council could consider.
And Jan, if I could interject, I think the concept of this was more for the commercial properties and the rights of way in front of commercial properties. And while residential is a component to it, I think we have to guard ourselves not to put the emphasis on that residential component.
Understood. And commercial speech, generally, as a rule, commercial speech tends to have less First Amendment protection than other speech. And it's there's sort of an inconsistency in the courts that say, well, you can't regulate signs based on content, but the courts have distinguished between commercial signage and what has less protection, or adult use speech has less protection than commercial, which has less protection than philosophical, ideological, or political. But the commercial signage, I think, that's the bigger issue here. And certainly if somebody wants to put in a permanent sign that's something other than their actual commercial message, they want to put in some other religious or political message, arguably that'd be allowed within the confines of the sign.
They could put offensive words. They could put offensive thoughts in there.
Well, sort of. I mean, there are some limits. I mean, it's not a free-for-all. But that becomes their choice, and sort of the market decides. I don't want to go there because I don't agree with their political.
I think once you start regulating signs in general, it becomes very difficult. What is the line, and how much do you do it? So there's going to always be some open space in the sign regulations. And I think we have to
flexibility.
Yeah.
Well, and again, I think the sort of engineering or scientific standard for the square footage of signs is very, very objective. It's the complete opposite of content based. We're not telling you, hey, retail stores, you can have this much signage. Hey, industrial, you can have this much. To some degree. I mean, it's a lot of it's based on these sort of street speeds and those kinds of things. So that to me is a very, very safe way to go from a legal standpoint in terms of challenges to our sign code. So I think we really, the legal department supports this kind of notion of street speeds and distance from the street in terms of how much signage you get, because it's a very objective measurement. Whether that's good policy or not, that's up to you.
I have one question. Councilman Lamerson, you brought it up, that talked about a sign code for all areas of commercial. I thought we were making some distinction in the downtown area, or zoning-based issues.
In the UDC, it was discussed that you've got several different areas in the city, downtown being somewhat different than other areas in the city, and that UDC proposed to forward something to the P&Z based on certain criteria.
Right.
And the downtown was considered different, especially with sandwich signs.
Exactly.
Okay, which is a little different than someplace else. But I don't know that from a legislative perspective, I would tell people in the downtown it's okay for you to clutter up the sidewalks in the downtown, but you can't clutter up the sidewalk out on Gurley Street in the motel area. I think at that particular time, from an individual, I'm talking as an individual now, not as a council body as a whole. At that point, what I've done is try to pick and choose winners, and that is not something that I would support as an individual. I don't support telling people downtown you can do one thing, but the people out here on Gurley Street can't do the same as you.
Thank you.
That personally, I have an issue with that.
I appreciate that.
Okay?
Thank you. George.
Under prohibited signs, there's item D that says signs mounted, attached to or painted on trailers, boats, or motor vehicles. And let's take a couple examples.
Jane Clancy.
Downtown, you have Franny's Frozen Yogurt. It's a vehicle they drive into work every day, and they oftentimes shuffle it around for the 2-hour parking, but it's always kind of near their. Then you got Jay's Bird Barn. that's a great big panel truck that's just sitting out there all day, that it isn't something somebody drives to work, that it's basically a sign on the road. So it would seem like Franny's Frozen Yogurts, that's okay that they have their own personal vehicle that's got advertising for their own business on it and parked out around their business, you know?
Well, you need to read.
Is this a big issue, George?
Huh?
If you read the definite, but if you need to read the entire paragraph, because what it says is if you're using the vehicle in place of permanent signage for your business, you can't do it. If you're using the vehicle for the conduct of business and it has signage on it, that's what everyone does in commercial uses. Everyone who delivers has a delivery truck with their logo on it and their name on it.
And we've all been up and down I-17, down by Black Canyon City.
And
we see a trailer that says "Vote for Jane Clancy." Well, that's not a.
That would fall under this prohibition because the vehicle's being used for a sign and not the sign being incidental to the use of the vehicle. The Frozen Franny's is a great example of that. They do use the vehicle. Jay's Bird Barn delivers with that truck. It moves. So they actually fall into that criteria.
It's set out by the street.
Well, it is. It's on the same property as their business.
They didn't want to take up the valuable parking space, I suppose.
Yeah. The issue there, though, is what we're trying to do is to prevent someone from using these vehicles and then adding signage on top of it, because the vehicles tend to get parked in places that obstruct vision of other people.
And we can give a specific example of what happened in Prescott a couple of elections ago. Ken Bennett parked a trailer out off of Willow Creek Road. I mean, that's the kind of thing that says, hey, that's in lieu of or in place of some signage, so that's not allowed.
And it was also premature.
Parking that trailer. Well, and we're getting away from that timing issue, because it's very, courts have said, how that's, for instance, 60 days. A limit on a political sign 60 days before the election is a no-go. Can't do that. But they never said, but they don't legislate, so they don't say 90 days is cool or 120 days is okay. They just say 60 days is not enough. And so you sort of know where your starting point is, where your threshold is, but you don't know where your border is.
And I think we're getting a little far afield here. We're here to talk about a change in the LDC in reference to signs in the right-of-ways, and mainly commercial.
No, signs on private property, not in the right-of-way.
Right.
The right-of-way issue has already been forwarded to council, and they've taken action on that one.
So I think we got to be careful that we don't get too far afield. And we're not going to fix all the sign issues. There's a lot of people that have. We have 2 sign company representatives here today.
Yes.
Well, we had to, and they might have a different philosophy than some other people.
And that is one thing I want to point out, and we put it on as a public hearing because it starts the process, but our intention is for you to not take any action on this, for us to bring it back to you in about a month for some action, so that we have an opportunity to spend more time with the sign companies to make sure that this is very practical from their aspect as well.
Yeah, on these temporary signs, Mr. Palladini, have we seen any other jurisdictions that have created a time limit that seems to be enforceable? I mean, 60 days is one thing, but 180 days is a long time.
I think that's the challenge. Now, temporary signs on private property, again, we ban temporary signs in the right-of-way, so there is no time limit applicable. Temporary signs on private property are difficult because, again, if you're saying, well, political signs have a time limit, X number of days before an election.
Don't say any sign.
Well, you could put an across-the-board time limit on any temporary sign. Would have to be removed, let's say, after 6 months or after 3 months. Now, the challenge there is, in an election, that may make sense. I put up my sign in June, and the election's in August.
Are we requiring a permit here? Aren't we requiring a permit?
For commercial properties.
And in terms of, well, temporary signage for commercial uses.
We recommended in this draft 180 days.
Right, and that's a little different because that's going to be the pumpkin patch, the Christmas tree farm, farm or whatever you want to call it on a lot, going out of business sale, a grand opening sale. an event, maybe they'll advertise an event. You know, if somebody wants to put on a rodeo sign on their commercial building, it's perfectly fine. So there is sort of an allowed time limit, again, not based on content, but just simply based on objective criteria. The 180 days is really, again, a policy call for you all, and then ultimately the council. 180 days too long, 120 days fine. When we're but and again, because we're dealing with the residential signs, maybe not to as great a degree, but the problem there, I think we need to stay away from the time limits on residential signage, because in the context of, well, let's say I put a real estate sign up and it takes me a year to sell my house. Well, why should I have to take the sign down in 3 months or 6 months? And if you say, well, you can only put a political sign up on my house, on the front yard of my house for 30 or 40 days, or I mean, sorry, 3 or 4 months before the election, then you're all of a sudden you have a content-based distinction of political sign or ideological sign. You know, I could put up a impeach Obama sign for a year, but I can only put up a vote for Smith sign for 3 months, and my real estate sign can be up indefinitely. That's a problem. So when it comes to the residential signage, really no time limit. When it comes to commercial signage, again, different, because it's any temporary sign, no matter what the message, has a time limit. 180 days, 150, 120, 360, your call. Policy question.
I see a problem with the proliferation of political signs and allowing them to start so much earlier and stay up, you know, unrestricted. I mean, I lived in one community in Houston where a guy moved in and put a 6 by 10 foot sign on his front lawn that said, "Get out of the UN."
Well, again,
you know, and it
caused. Size would be prohibitive.
Right.
But if somebody put up a 2 by 3 sign to say "Get out of the UN," they can leave it up as long as they want. Yeah. Because again, if we say you can put that up for 6 months, or you can put up a vote for Smith sign for 4 months around the election.
Yeah, well, that's content.
Right. Yeah, and I think we have to be careful. A sign package or a sign amendment to our LDC is not going to solve all of the issues that we might have to deal with and care about.
And I don't see any enforcement provisions in here or any penalties. I mean, someone can just completely ignore this and have no recourse.
The Land Development Code is actually Chapter 10 of the City Code. The City Code's Chapter 1 or 2. One has enforcement and consequences established in it that are applicable to every other code that's part of that City Code. So those are actually in a separate section.
Councilman Lamberson.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. You know, you have to be very careful what you do on private property. And when you talk about limiting signage, length of time of signage, define a sign that may be on private property, which travels with a lease, travels with ownership, etc. Marketing a business. It could be ABC Real Estate Company, who's got their window painted with the intent of marketing their business directly adjacent to public right-of-way. Be careful of what you propose be drafted.
Absolutely.
Or passed on to City Council that would limit the freedom of a private property owner to market their place of business on their property, either by time or by size.
I agree. You know, and we do have, the conversation came up some time ago. I recall when we were talking the sandwich boards downtown, that we have to be careful, because if you have a business, you want the world to know you're there. And one of the purposes of a sign is to distract people from what they're doing, whether they're walking down the sidewalk or driving their car down Willow Creek Road or Gurley Street. The intention is to take you away from what you're doing and look at me. And I think we have to be careful how much regulation we do have, because any of these businesses could put lights on in the window of their business downtown and have flashing lights and do things that we may not like. And I think if that's what you're referring to, Jim, we got to be careful of what we ask for, and you can overregulate this fairly easily. I think this is a pretty simple concept.
One of the things we tried to do is to simplify the approach to sign regulations.
I do have one question. You talked earlier about height. 2 changes of height were made.
We established a maximum height for temporary signs on residential property of 5 feet. So we have a height limitation to temporary signs, not a length of time, nor a
But in
total
other
number.
zonings, didn't you have a reference to high and changing heights?
It varies by the speed of the district again.
And did you change something in this proposal from what had been?
Since the UDC saw it, no, that wasn't changed. We did change one thing that we hadn't put in previously. During the discussion with the members of the UDC, it came up with one of the members that we need to address commercial shopping center signs as a separate entity from the business signs inside of them. And we did add that, and you'll see that listed as part of the freestanding signs for shopping centers.
And is that the two that I see highlighted here, the 20
Yes, it
foot?
is.
What
Yes.
were they before?
They weren't in there.
They weren't in there at
They're
all.
currently in our sign code now,
Gotcha.
the LDC sign code, but we were focused on signs for the business rather than the shopping center, and that was added to accommodate shopping centers need to have a separate identity identified on a sign.
Thank you.
I've got a, kind of personal comment from the way I try to find things, and that is, you mentioned the size changing with the speed. I believe that the address number is the same everywhere. And when I'm trying to find someplace new, I'm looking for addresses, and I don't see them. I mean, anyway, I want to know if am I on the 600 block, am I on the 800 block, whatever. And perhaps having an address number on more signs would be beneficial. Second comment, in general, we've all been to cities, with more signs, fewer signs. The ones with the fewer and smaller signs look better. So when you said the sizes go up a little bit, I'd go the other direction personally. I think, fewer signs, smaller signs, you're still stand out, but they don't have to be as big as perhaps we allow. So those are my comments.
And I think that's great. That's a great point. I personally am dealing with this very issue ourselves with our shopping center, where I tend to like the lower, smaller, diminutive signs. We have a situation, you talk about shopping centers. Your typical shopping center has a street and then a big area of parking, and the stores are back someplace else. In our particular case, we have businesses 40, 50 feet from the right-of-way. And so they all would love a huge 20-foot sign. So we're spending most of our time trying to get them to bring it down, because their building will be their sign. It's close enough to the street. So I think the concept of trying to make rules for everything can be difficult. Properties are different, each one. So I'm like Joe, though. I tend to like shorter.
And we've left in, to accommodate some circumstances like that, we have left in the whole process of comprehensive sign plans for those complicated or unusual or difficult properties to develop, so
Which
that
is
they
a
have the
helpful
option.
program.
They have the option to go through that.
Thank you. Any other comments for George? Any questions?
Yeah, do you deal with electronic signs?
Yes, we've left
Any
the
changes
criteria. We left the criteria the same as was adopted a couple of years ago by recommended by this commission and adopted by council, limiting how much of a permanent sign can be, changeable copy, and then the criteria for frequency of change would stay the same. It would stay the same as it is under the current requirements. So we do have one sign company left here. I don't know if he has any comments, but we're appreciative of hearing those. And again, we want to have a meeting with the sign companies in town to try and get some input on this before we bring it back to you for any action.
Be careful what you ask for. They're going to want bigger. Sir, do you have any comments you'd like to make today to the group and to the public at home who might be watching? And you will have to give your name.
Good morning, Brian Wywick, A&B Sign Company. I just got the copy of this yesterday, so I didn't have a lot of time to look through it, but just listening to the last, I don't know, we've been here 3 hours, 2.5 hours. The one thing that I kept on hearing all morning that I think is important is the word flexibility, because the one size fits all thing just works most of the time, but occasionally it doesn't work out so well. So as long as there's a mechanism, like George just mentioned, of the comprehensive sign plan to address those weird situations where private businesses, private property owners have a way of advertising their business in a functional way, I think everything's fine. Reading through this, I had a couple of questions, which I don't know if this is the time to bring them up or not, but the wall-mounted signs, just thinking of the downtown area, we're working with a client right now that has a very narrow storefront. I think it's only like 12 feet. So if you did the half a square foot, that would be a 6 square foot sign, which to me seems, I mean, that's really, really small. So I just think that there might be situations where that doesn't work out so well. But as far as the rest of the freestanding, the speed limit based, that seemed really like a good way to go. And it's just the wall-mounted standards that seem in certain situations might be a little restrictive. But other than that, it looks all right to me.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
George, you got more for us? On
One
this
other
topic?
issue, similar to the issue we discussed earlier about density in the downtown, there are some specific requirements for review and approval of signs within our historic preservation districts, just like the building type and design in the downtown we spoke earlier of. That would still apply in these cases. The historic preservation district's looking at the aesthetic of the sign itself. It is not looking at the content necessarily, nor is it looking at the dimensions of the sign. That's what this code would do. But they are looking at what it would require to comply with their criteria as well as the criteria of the Land Development Code. So there are other codes that sort of overlap and interlace with this one.
Okay, thank you. If there's no further comments, I do want to announce that we've pulled 2 items that was on our initial agenda that we're going to be talking about
at a future date.
So,
Thank
just
you.
want to let the public know that. Any city updates?
None at the moment, sir. We do anticipate having items for you at a meeting at the end of the month, your regular meeting date, the 28th. So look forward to some contact from us in the near future.
Thank
on
you.
that.
With that, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Why do we get these